In this day and age, it feels like everyone has an opinion on everything. Some of these opinions are harmless, like Coke or Pepsi. Some of these opinions don't matter, like any team other than the Lakers. But for a lot of us, it feels like our opinions are a matter of life and death. I'm Pastor Paul Conway. I'm here with Pastor Noah Bond. Noah, how are you?
I'm doing really great, Paul. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for asking. I'm doing very well. Thank you for joining us in this white void of nothingness. It's good to have you here.
Oh, my pleasure. I love the scene.
Yeah, we put a tree for you to make a little splash of color for you. But We're filming today. We're having this conversation because it is currently the month of November. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but things have been pretty tense this month so far.
Oh, I'm very aware, Paul. Yeah, it seems everyone seems to be at each other's throats, kind of with the little conflict in politics.
We had a pretty big presidential election, and it happens every 4 years. And it feels like, especially around anything political, especially nowadays, I can't speak too much before my time, but it feels like nowadays the political climate is super intense. Everything feels so divided and angry and bitter, especially around the idea of politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's an area of our lives that we're gonna inevitably face. And I mean, even these students, you guys probably can't vote yet, many of you, but it's still something that they're going to have to go through, and they're going to have to grow into and apply into their life. And so I think we'd be wrong to not talk about it.
Yeah, the tendency is, I hear a lot of Christians try, whenever they hear anything political or any kind of government conversations, they want to like shy away from it, and they'll be like, "Oh, that's not really I don't really want to deal with it. I don't want to go there." But people are talking about it. And so we should be asking the question, like, how do we as Christians talk about politics, engage in political conversations?
Yeah, it's a really important question that we ask. And I mean, we just spent the last 4 weeks or so talking about what is the Bible and what does the Bible say about how we live our life. So I think it's really important that we address what the Bible says in even things like this. So Paul, what in your abundance of biblical knowledge, what would you say the Bible says about the political atmosphere and how we are supposed to relate to it?
Yeah, as far as abundance of biblical knowledge goes, I Googled, what does the Bible say about politics?
Perfect,
and got a bunch of verses.
ChatGPT.
ChatGPT, this whole message. That's a great question. And yes, like as followers of Jesus, as Christians, like we hold the Bible to be sacred and important and carry an abundance of wisdom in and of itself. Yeah. And the thing about the Bible that we spent the last 4 weeks talking about is sometimes they will say different things about the same thing depending on where they are or when they are. And the government is a huge thing that actually comes up a lot, but it changes depending on when and where. So for example, the Old Testament, for the most part, it was written from the perspective of like kings and governors. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, and that literally means the law. And so it's like giving legal law. So to say that the Bible isn't political is to like miss a pretty big point of the Bible. And so, especially the Old Testament, it holds that the law is important and we should be careful about our laws. But that's not the case for the whole Bible. I think, especially once you get to the New Testament, you see opinions start to change because the circumstance changes.
Yeah, and I think I have a little bit more New Testament knowledge than I do Old Testament knowledge, just from what I've grown up reading and the different things that I've come through in my life. And I think one verse that immediately comes to mind, we have it right here. It says, "First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life." And I think we have kind of a tendency, if something isn't going our way, we want to immediately fight back at it. And sometimes, I mean, we might think of a revolt or a rebellion against a government that we don't like. But that's not what we see that we're meant to do here as Christians. We see that our calling is actually to lead a peaceful and quiet life. So Paul, what does that really look like for us in this kind of?
That's a great question. And yes, you're starting to see, especially once you get into the New Testament, feelings towards the government changes, and it comes down to what I would say is priorities. What are the things you're going to stand for and fight for, and what are the things that you're going to let go of? And we might talk about this more later, but this is a theme and this is a lesson that you could apply to any like subject of your life.
Yeah.
Politics is kind of the theme that we're taking the next few weeks, but your priorities of what are things I'm going to fight for and what are things I'm going to let go of are going to shape how you live your life. And so for these people, especially writing the New Testament, creating the church and spreading the message of God was more important than establishing a new government. And so you don't see a lot of passages about take up arms and fight back, but it's saying like, hey, like here's another passage, like be submissive to rulers and authorities, be obedient and be ready for every good work. Be submissive and be ready for every good work. So it's to say, hey, try not like, don't fight this worldly battle when there are so many good works to do. And that comes from priorities.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a really important passage that Jesus talked about, is the idea that we are supposed to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. And that applies to governments as well. If we have a government that's not aligning with our Christian beliefs, it doesn't say that we are to fight back at them and, overthrow them, but we're supposed to love them and pray for them. And I think through that, we're leading that peaceful life that we are called to. As Christians, that's going to be a huge theme. I mean, you brought up before when we were talking that the two greatest commandments are love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so as Christians, we're called to love people even if they disagree with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that comes down to priorities and caring for people above all else. And that's why I'm honestly so surprised at how many Christians I see who put so much stock in who's going to be the next president and the government, one way or the other. Yep. And it's like, do you not recognize that God is so much bigger than this? And we see passages like this as well. It says, "For kings belong to the Lord, and He rules over the nations." Or something else. God is speaking. Says, "By me kings reign." So we have to recognize that, like, yeah, the governments are going to exist and they have their role and their purpose, but ultimately God is the authority. And prioritizing that and recognizing that, yeah, the government can do a lot of good, and we'll talk about that in a second, but ultimately caring for people is what's most important, and the government's not going to do that job. God's going to do that job. And so, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's a really great point, Paul. And I think that's not to say that politics and government is not an important area. God is the top of the list, right? But government and politics, that's still important. But people are our priority. And if you guys are at Rancho, you just heard Pastor Roy talk about this last Wednesday at One Night. People are our priority. And there's a difference between being apolitical and apathetic.
Yeah.
I think what that means is if you can be apolitical and you can stay neutral in these situations, but don't let that become an apathy where you're not even caring about whatever happens, because when that happens, you're not concerning yourselves with how politics affect other people. You're just thinking about how it affects you.
Yeah.
And as Christians, that's something we need to avoid at all costs, that kind of selfish mentality.
Yeah, I hear sentiment a lot to say like, it doesn't really matter because Jesus is king. And it's like that, in some sense, I hear what you're saying, but on the other end, policies and regulations and laws affect people. And insofar as they affect people, we should care about it.
Yeah.
Because if it's like, if my decision, if my votes, if that changes the way people are experiencing the world, and if it affects the way people are living, then we should care about it. Absolutely. And so you bring up a good point. To be apolitical, there's a difference between being apolitical and apathetic, and there's a temptation to be both.
Yeah, I know. And I know a lot of our students, you guys can't vote yet, right?
Yeah.
But these are things you can bring into conversations too. There's an idea of if people around you, whether it's your family or your friends, they're having a political discussion, a political conversation, there is something to being neutral, but you could also bring a lot of good into that conversation with what you believe.
Yeah.
Even if you can't vote, you have the beliefs that you're allowed to have beliefs about these things. So I think we need to kind of navigate that line of bringing something productive to the conversation as Christians, instead of just saying, you know what, it doesn't affect me, and I don't need to vote. And there's something too about like if you're in 6th grade and you're like, you know what, this doesn't affect me at all right now. I want to play video games and eat Cheetos all day.
Same.
We're not gonna fault you for that. Like that's totally fair. But it is. I mean, eventually you're going to have to face this, and so I think it's something that it's important we bring it up right now.
It feels like, as we talked about earlier, things feel so angry and bitter and mean, and divisive. And when we see that stuff, sometimes our natural reaction is to say, I'm just going to remain neutral then. I'm not going to do anything. And yeah, I guess when the standard is evil and bad and terrible, doing nothing is a step above that.
Yeah.
And like Noah said, like, yeah, if you wanted to just say, hey, I'm not going to participate in these conversations or whatever because I don't want to hurt, I don't want to cause more harm that's happening, I think that that's a fair response to have. But
Totally.
I would also say that you can bring good into conversations. So for example, like a huge topic of conversation right now is immigration, right? And we're not going to talk about our stances on immigration here because that's not the point. The point is you can have an opinion and you can try and do all the research you can and you have this stuff. But if you are in class and your classmate is a child of people who came here illegally, you can have whatever opinion you want. The way you talk about that topic, your classmates will listen to. They will hear you. And so sometimes we like to justify ourselves because we think that we're right. But even if we think we're right, we're not always helpful. And so again, you could have whatever opinion you want. I hope that your opinion is well-researched and thorough and you've thought about it. But regardless of your opinion, the way you talk about it matters. And these things affect people, and it may not affect you. You might be in a position where these things don't affect you a whole lot, but they're affecting a lot of people. And sometimes those people are a lot closer than you think.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really great point of the things we say and the way we say them really matters, and also why we say them really matters. There's a verse, 1 Corinthians 13:1. It says, "If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal." Point is, if we're saying things and we're correct as Christians,
If we think we're correct.
but we're saying it out of a desire to win a debate,
Yeah.
or to be right, and not saying it out of a love for another person, that's not what God wants us to do. That's not what we're called to do as Christians.
Yeah. And that's exactly the point that you bring up, that I think so many people, the reason why they're so passionate about these political conversations, I think on one end, I think they're passionate because it does affect them. But I think a vast majority of people are passionate about them because they want to be right.
Yeah.
And they want to be powerful. And they want to be strong. And the desire for political gain is now, it's no longer for compassion or empathy. It's for power and for being right. And sometimes I'll find myself stuck in a political conversation because I get very passionate about these things. That's no surprise to anybody who knows me. Like, I do get passionate about a lot of things, and this is honestly one of them. But the temptation often in my heart, and I'm sure in your heart and many people watching, the desire is to be right. And as soon as we lose the empathy, as soon as we lose compassion and we put in a desire for looking like the person who won a debate, we've lost the whole point. We've lost the point.
Yeah, and as we're going to be talking about this, our students are going to be moving into small groups in a second here and having their own conversations about this. And I think it's important to note that these ideas of bringing love and compassion into the way you speak and the reason behind your words, these can be applied to any disagreements in your life. So if you're in 6th grade and you're like, oh, I can't vote yet, doesn't matter, that's fair. But there's probably some other disagreement in your life that you can apply this sort of idea to. And so just be aware of that as you go into your conversations with people and especially with your groups.
So with that, as we move into our small groups, let's keep that at the forefront, that whenever you feel the temptation to be right and to embarrass another person who you disagree with, or to talk smack about a group of people who aren't there and who aren't represented in your small group, let's resist those temptations. And instead, let's fight for peace. Let's hold on to empathy and compassion. And let's be peacemakers in our conversations. Guys, I'm looking forward to the conversations that we're having in the small group. I'm looking forward to next week as well. We'll be back in this space next week, and we're going to be talking about how do we be a part of something better. Guys, it's been such a pleasure. We'll see you next week.